Welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's brought to you by the National Rural Network. My name is Declan Phelan and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm also supported here by my colleague John Galogli, who will be in charge of questions and answers and in case any IT issues arise, and James Claffey from Irish Rural Link, who's helped me with setting up this event, and obviously our guest speaker, Ruth Wilson from the National Biodiversity Data Centre on pollinators. The NRN is a consortium which is led by Irish Rural Link in support of the Wheel, NUIG and Philip Farley & Co. With the aim of, it's funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, with the aim of building membership to disseminate information on the Rural Development Programme and the funding that's available within that. So I suppose we'll get kicking off. As I said, you're all very welcome to the webinar, which is titled Seasonal Actions for Pollinators on Farmland. As we all know, pollinators are vitally important for Irish agriculture and as well as our food systems and ecosystems. Pollinator habitats can also provide benefits to the farm, such as preventing soil erosion, improving biodiversity, which also helps flowering plants to reproduce. In Ireland, 1/3 of our bee species are threatened with extinction for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure Ruth will touch on within our presentation. Hopefully this webinar will provide the audience with a list of actions which, if implemented correctly on farmland, will help sustain and enhance our pollinator numbers. Ruth Wilson, who's the Farmland Pollinator Officer with the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Ruth started as a Farmland Pollinator Officer in 2021 and to assist the implementation of the farmland actions of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan within the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Ruth grew up on a mixed farm in County Antrim, which led her to study horticulture and then land and environmental management. She has over 20 years experience working in local biodiversity planning and nature conservation within local governments and non-government conservation organisations. The All-Ireland Pollinator Plan Farmland Officer position has been funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. So without any further ado, I will pass you over to Ruth, who is going to go through a presentation for the next 20-25 minutes, and then we will finish up with another 20-25 minutes of questions and answers then. So if there's any issues, as I said, pop them into the chat there, and you're all welcome to ask questions and answers at any stage. So Ruth, it's over to you. You can share your screen. Work great.
Thank you very much for inviting me along this morning. I'm delighted to be here. And just a wee introduction, Declan has said I'm doing a wee piece on seasonal actions for pollinators on farmland. So I'll just go ahead and start. I'm based out of the National Biodiversity Centre, and as Declan has said, I work on the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan as the Farmland Officer. So really looking at what actions are possible on farmland to help our pollinators and wider biodiversity. We've created these little seasonal actions that you could take on farmland. This morning we'll be looking at the summer and autumn actions. And maybe at a later date, we'll look at the winter and spring actions. So it's really just simple actions that you could take on farmland. I'll just go give you a wee bit of background before I go into the actions. So Ireland, we have a wonderful variety of species on the island of Ireland, over 30,000 species living in 117 habitats. So really have a lot to celebrate on the island of Ireland. There is a concern of the biodiversity loss within species that have been assessed. It's thought that there's 17% are threatened with extinction from Ireland. So that is a concern for us all. And habitats assessed, 9% were in a good state. So we just need to check, what we're doing on really homes for species really on the island. And then just looking at pollinators, just how valuable pollinators are for us. Globally, 100 crops provide 90% of the world's food supply. So that's really, really, really quite a large amount. And over 70% of 71 of these are pollinated by bees. So we're very dependent for our economy and wealth and health and well-being for pollinators. And then for wild plants, just under 80% of wild plants are pollinated by insects. So if we have a good diversity of insects, that's more wild bees equals more resilient wild plants, and that leads on to more insects and invertebrates, and also, you know, healthy fruits and seeds for us as a food supply, and also for wider biodiversity, supports more birds and animal species. Then just looking at some of the other benefits, we've said a diversity of pollinators, it's good for crop pollination and wild plant pollination, but there's other benefits as well, wider ecosystem services benefits like waste recycling, pest control, and prey for insectivores. And then on co-benefits, they're known as, but it helps with climate regulation, human health and well-being, landscape and culture, stable soils, and reduced flood risk. So that's really just having a healthy environment, good habitats that are resilient, can help us with wider issues that we're dealing with. And the plight of pollinators is typical of many components of biodiversity at the minute. So when we look at wild pollinators, we have one managed honeybee, and we have 21 bumblebees, and 79 solitary bees. And 1/3 of our wild pollinators are threatened with extinction from the island of Ireland. We also have established a bumblebee monitoring scheme within the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and we're seeing the decline. So that was started in 2012, and there's still a decline of our bumblebees, you know, in the wider environment. So it's just we still haven't got really enough good habitat, food and shelter and safety for our pollinating insects in the wider landscape. The rare species are disappearing through the loss of semi-natural habitat, and I'll go into a wee bit of what semi-natural habitat is in the presentation. And our common species are declining in abundance as a consequence of how we manage the rest of the landscape. Just to show you the sheer variety of bumblebees, they're always a very visual insect, especially if you hear them and see them at the queens in the spring. They're beautiful species, and then now we're seeing the smaller, the workers, and being very busy collecting pollen and nectar. So very lovely species to observe. Then we have 79 solitary bees, which are maybe not as easy to see, but when you start seeing them, it's amazing. I've really noticed a lot more this year, just being a wee bit more aware. So good variety of solitary bees, and they're important for pollination. And just to say that with a change in climate, some of our species are starting to expand their range. So we've had 2 bees, 21 and 22, so 2 more solitary bees have come to Ireland just through range expansion. One is the ivy bee. There were 2 lovely bees, and another one, the hairy-footed flower bee. So they're very welcome. And just to say, the wild bees, they don't go far from, if you see them, you know, they don't travel far. So if we look at the bumblebee, it can go up to 5 kilometres, but really it just forages 1 and at a maximum 2 kilometres from the nest. So they don't go too far, and it's good to have so much. I've just put down at the bottom there from January, you know, from February through to October, if you have flowers, a good variety of flowers in the environment, that just provides enough food for the pollinators, you know, at a close by range. And the solitary bee even forages less distance. It's most commonly 100 to 200 meters from the nest, but they could go a kilometer, but it's best if there's a good variety of food nearby. Just some of the other pollinators that the new All Ireland Pollinator Plan is wanting to raise awareness of as well is Hoverflies, it's amazing. We have about 180 species of hoverfly in Ireland, and we believe there's approximately 20% are estimated to be under threat. They're very valuable for farmers and gardeners. They're known as the farmer's friend, because part of their life cycle is beneficial insect, will forage on aphids. So a wonderful species for farmland. Then just looking at some of the other species that also contribute to pollination, butterflies, moths, beetle, wasps, ants. And on the island of Ireland, 18% of butterflies and 8% of macro moths, so that's the bigger moths, are thought to be threatened with extinction. The photograph there is of a beautiful garden tiger moth. So they really are stunning, and there's a lot of macro moths on the island of Ireland. I was just taking a wee look at the life cycle of a moth, just to this would go across a lot of those insects. They have different stages. So it's not just the food, the pollen and nectar stage. The adult will require, it will be around this. I've just taken a buff ermine. So the adult will be around hedges, gardens, woodlands, and parks. That's where you'll find it foraging. And then it'll lay its eggs, and the caterpillar, in particularly this one, looks for nettles and honeysuckle to feed on. And then when it goes into a pupa, that pupa is just left on the ground, actually, in plant debris, such as leaf litter or a base of a hedgerow. And so it needs that habitat as well to survive the winter before it emerges in the spring. So they need a few things in the landscape, not just the food as well. In farmland, it has changed a lot really in the last 50 years. We would have had a low intensity agriculture, which was very pollinator friendly. And then that's changed now to really intensive agriculture, which is not so pollinator friendly. And that led to the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, where we have, we're on the second phase, 21 to 25, and 186 actions over 6 objectives, just to increase the area of pollinator friendly areas on farmland, sustainable use of pesticides, more training and information, and positive awareness raising, and to track some of those changes. And the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine have supported my role within the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and also an Agri-Environment Officer as well, supported through Board BIA. And so it's really more engagement, more training, and we always use evidence-based resources really to recommend and for more guidance. And really, it's just a positive approach to raise awareness and celebrate farmland, pollinators, and biodiversity. And it can all seem a bit daunting at times, but the good news is that lots of small actions taken together can begin to solve big problems. So it's really to look at everything positively. And the All Ireland Pollinator, if you just think food, shelter, and safety, in doing this, you can help protect biodiversity in general. So we've created these seasonal lists. I'll just start with the summer. And I've just looked at just small actions that we could take throughout the year. Just looking at what's happening to bumblebees just at this time of year. The queen has started to lay eggs, and then female workers will emerge from the nest, and their main duty is really to get pollen and bring it back to feed the developing larvae. And later on, the queen lays unfertilized eggs, and they will become the males. In the solitary bees, they've been very busy. They female lays the eggs, and in each little cell, they will leave food supply for the larvae, and they will emerge and eat that. And it's usually in cavities underground. I'm not sure if I put a wee photo in, or in little cavities, or ground nesting for the solitary bees. So really important just to have food throughout the season. I just mentioned about how the distances are very small that pollinators travel. So you will remember, I'm sure you've noticed the dandelions now are starting to die back, but really from early on, we're looking at food throughout the seasons, really from dandelion, dead nettle, hog nettle, hogweed, and then later right through to the devil's bit scabious and knapweed that are later in the season. So it's just to have a good variety of wild plants in the environment. And at this time of year, white clover is important, white and red clover, bushvetch, honeysuckle, bird's foot trefoil. And the pollinators, they help to pollinate our crops, fruit and vegetables. And I'm not sure if they haven't been pollinated well, it's the fruit doesn't fully form. So it just really helps with the yield of fruit and our crops. So it just boosts the yield immensely. And they will use that pollen and nectar, but it's just at a one-off sort of food source for them. So they have to have a good variety of these wild plants in the environment, in the landscape, for them to feed on. Lovely pollinators to look out for at this time of year are the leafcutter bees. Lovely little solitary bee. If you have any roses or wild roses, you will see maybe little round holes in them, very precisely cut, and the leaf cutter bees take that little leaf and line their nest with it. So a lovely solitary bee to look out for. Also the red-tailed bumblebee, it's a good one to get your eye into. They have declined from farmland. So the queen is all black body with a red tail. Another nice one to see if you can spot. And then I've mentioned the hoverfly. There's just one wee hoverfly, the marmalade hoverfly. The larvae being fantastic at eating aphids. So it's a wonderful, as I've said, farmer's friend. If you'd like to learn more about identification, I would recommend you go to Biodiversity Ireland. There's guides and swatches on some of the species. There's some training workshops take place over the summer, and we encourage any recording of sightings to our Biodiversity Ireland. And then seasonal actions that you can do in the summer to help pollinators. Non-farmed areas are very important, and we would really encourage you to leave wildflowers to naturally grow. So that could be a farm lane, field margin, the corner of a field, or watercourse area where you're going to be leaving a buffer strip. And it's really just to let the wildflowers develop in these areas throughout the summer. I've just put some up there that we're looking very well these past few weeks: hogweed, red clover, elder, and that's a wee picture of a margin that can really develop into lovely wildflower areas. The dandelion's over, but mostly over. There's still some going, but sow thistle and hawkbite now are shown, and they're also very good for our pollinators. This is lovely. We call this nice tussocky field margin, and in these type of areas, be very good for bumblebee nests and good cover in there for all wildlife. And an activity you can do this month, we have a little app. If you download an app called the Fit Count, you can watch an area for 10 minutes and just count how many pollinators visit that area. And that is going to show useful information just on what plants pollinators are visiting. It's a very user-friendly little survey, and it just simplifies how we record pollinators. So I would highly recommend that you download that app and have a go at that survey. You could also look at butterflies. This is a simple garden butterfly survey. It just takes 15 minutes. And there's more information on Biodiversity Ireland on the survey section. Just to say on seasonal actions, the data centre has a lovely farmers wildlife calendar, which is supported by the Department of Agriculture, and that just is looking at some of the spring species and when they're active in the spring. So it helps us see what's happening with just changing climate and temperatures and stuff. So that's a spring one. Another action then, moving on to later in the summer, is to just apply fertilizer. Leave some unfertilized areas is wonderful. So if we leave a base at a hedgerow, this can develop into very, for the native wildflowers to develop. So it's just to give the hedges a wee bit of space, and it can really, hedges are very special, important semi-natural habitat. So if we're just stepping back a wee bit and leaving that margin, it can benefit pollinators and biodiversity a lot. This farmer here on the right, he just fenced, temporary fence, whilst he was grazing cattle, and left that margin. And then at the end of the season, the fence is lifted and the cattle can graze that. So it's good to cut and lift that area at the end of the season, end of August, September, and that'll just help to reduce the fertility in the area, and therefore the wildflowers will flourish. So very beneficial are the field margins. And then just some of the plants I've noticed in the field margins. Again, that's a vetch, hogweed, and buttercup, a wee sow thistle, hawkbite type plant there. Then later in the summer, I've just mentioned about it's good to cut and lift the wildflowers at the end of the season. We leave it late to let the seeds set, and you've provided pollen and nectar for a longer period. But it is good to cut and lift that, just to remove the nutrients and stop thatch building up in the grass. This is an example I've used of a semi-natural grassland area. There are not so many left, but just they're very valuable to pollinators and wider biodiversity. If there are any of these areas, really, it's to retain as much as possible in the landscape. And I think there's been a big increase. These were created at the end of last year, so there is a very big interest now in multi-species swards, which can help us reduce our fertilizer use, and it's good for pollinators. It's a temporary source of food for pollinators, but it can be useful. And just then it does, when it's used, they do pretty much clean it off. So that's the food source gone. So that's why it's good to have our hedges and our field margins healthy and full of wildflowers to support our pollinators. Then just moving into the autumn. And at this time, our bumblebees, the queen has laid eggs, and new queens will come out at the end of the autumn, and before they go into hibernation for the winter. And just the new queen will survive to start the cycle again in the spring. And again, the eggs of the solitary bees will hatch, and the larvae will eat that food supply, and then they will overwinter. And and that's the only solitary bees that will survive until the next year. At the end of autumn, it's so important to have as much pollen food in the environment as well for bumblebees, for example, because before they go into hibernation, they almost need to fatten up. So some of the later flowering plants are fantastic, such as self-heal, red clover, knapweed, and something that we're just really realizing how important ivy is. It's a wonderful supply late on, and it keeps going. You know, it keeps going quite far as on into the autumn, as does knapweed. And just some species that you could look out for: red admiral butter in the autumn. Or the common carder bee is also one that can be seen later in the season as well. And I'm going back to ivy here. Just it's very good to keep some ivy. It's a really good source. Well, I've put here it's critical source of pollen and nectar for late autumn. That wee first photo, that's an old stump, and deadwood is also good to keep in the environment. Just an old stump in a hedge, and I just thought it was lovely because we value the deadwood, and the ivy has topped it, so it's not damaging. It's not damaging it at all, and a fantastic resource for pollinators and wider biodiversity. And then in a tree as well. It's thought that the ivy doesn't affect the tree if it's healthy, and they can live together. Just bramble as well, not one that you maybe think too much of, but a wonderful supply. I see it started to flower now, and that flowers right through to the autumn. So just a great to have some bramble on the farm is great. Also, just to mention the stems, if they get knocked or whatever, the solitary bees can use them for nesting. And as we move into late autumn, you may be thinking of any hedges that might need gaps filled or restored. So you could start to plan now in the late autumn. But looking at doing it later on in the winter, and that's the example there, the wee circle photo of filling a gap with a tree. It can be difficult if you've grazing stock. There's some good protective guards, cactus guards, which are quite good to keep the animals off the tree. They love to nip the top of the tree off the shelter usually, but it just takes a wee bit of work to get that the gaps filled if you've got stock or no fencing near the hedge. And then just with restoring hedge, it's to keep as much as you can of the original hedge and interplant with some new species. And then that's the hawthorn, blackthorn, and then some other shrubs would be fantastic in there, like elder, gelder rose, honeysuckle, wild rose. Just on the cutting of your hedges, if we're cutting our hedges annually, we'll not get the flower developing on that wood. The flower will develop in older wood. So if it's possible to not cut annually, maybe move to a 3 or 5 year rotational cut around the farm, this will be very beneficial for our hedges. It'll also let them just keep them in a good state as well. And if we're cutting in an A shape, a nice thick bottom, which is good for stock proofing and also just for biodiversity, and it lets the light in as well to the hedge. And we would always just say as high and as wide as possible is wonderful if you can manage that. just to think about how within your farm and the neighbouring countryside and neighbouring farms, do they connect? It's very important to have hedges if there's a meeting into a woodland or a nature reserve. So just looking at how, there's no gaps in the landscape, and that allows wildlife pollinators to move across, within the landscape. They get shelter and protection. So that's very important, just to see if things are connecting, almost transport corridors for wildlife. Very, very important. Some activities then to think of, this is a wee bit off now in autumn, thinking way to autumn, but it's actually something that you would need to keep an eye on now. If you're wanting to encourage wildflowers in your field margins or areas like that, or field corners, just to keep an eye out for any wildflowers that you do already have locally. That's a wee picture of a bush vetch and the seeds developing. You can collect them if they're dry, pop them in an envelope and keep those to next spring and sow them. The next one is the wee yellow flower is yellow rattle. So that's it's also known as the meadow maker. So it can be good to develop species-rich grassland, and it would when the seed's ready, it rattles is where it's got its name. So you can collect those, and the seeds are different, and they go in before Christmas so that they get a sharp frost, to help with their germination, and then they'll sprout up in the spring. And just to say to enjoy your hedges as well. We've told you these brambles are good, so definitely as a family, definitely take what to enjoy some of the bramble berries, just leaving some for the birds as well was good. I'd just like to say, if you want to go to the pollinator plan farmland area section, we have some guidelines on farmland, and we've also some videos that are nice and easy to watch, and it looks at some of the plants, a wee summary of some of the plants, and how to maintain your hedges. There's lots of information in there. You're very welcome to have a look in there. And just to thank you very much for your time this morning. If you have any questions or anything in the future or want to get in contact, please just get in contact. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth, for that presentation. It's full of colourful imagery of our biodiversity habitats and all the different species that we have. I suppose I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague John now, who is going to go through the questions as they've been coming in the chat function or the Q&A. If there's anybody who still has any questions, pop them into the Q&A box or the chat, and John will address them to Ruth there now. And we'll run the questions and answers for about 15 or 20 minutes there now, or as long as the questions stay coming in. So with that, I'll pass you over to John.
Thanks, Declan. Thanks very much for your presentation, Ruth. Just a few questions coming in here. I suppose somebody's queried in terms of reseeding old grassland with multi-species sward. Is it a good idea to do this if your grassland isn't sort of producing a lot of good pollinator plants?
Very interesting question. If you have old pasture, old meadow, retain it. It is it's almost irreplaceable habitat, fantastic for pollinators and wider biodiversity. So it would not be the place for a multi-species sward, and I would really it's essential that we retain these habitats now, just to have that source in the landscape. So I'm sorry if I was unclear about that in the presentation, but it's really to retain, maintain, and if possible, restore the old pasture and meadows. Just the fantastic habitat.
I suppose then your multi-species will be more suitable to somewhere that's sort of already been reseeded with maybe rye pastures or something.
It's replacing the perennial ryegrass areas. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And then I suppose someone's just queried, many of the wildflower mixes that can be purchased are full of non-native flowers. Are these beneficial for Irish insects, or what would the advice be with regards to that?
We're encouraging natural regeneration. For example, if you have a field margin, we wouldn't recommend that you sow that with a wildflower mix. We would recommend that you just come back 2 meters or more if possible, and let that develop over the summer, spring and summer, and then cut and lift it end of August, September. And it will take patience. You mightn't see, it'll take 5 to 10 years. But if you're cutting and lifting that grass, it will reduce infertility, and there will be a great benefit to pollinators and wider biodiversity.
Brilliant, thanks, Ruth. Someone else just commented here, our pollinator parkland meadow is normally left uncut until the first flower bloom has passed, usually in July. This year it's ahead of schedule, and then it's cut and then to be cut again at the end of September or October. This method has resulted in a wide variety of old seed coming through, such as orchids and a wide variety of grasses. Do you think this is a good method?
That's in a public park, I think this.
I think it's it's in somebody's own own meadow.
No, traditionally hay meadows would be cut around July, and those have they're wonderful resources, and it is a good time to cut a traditional hay meadow around that time. Yes. I'm not sure about another cut at the autumn. I'm not sure what. Sometimes they bring, you would have grazing animals in the winter just to knock it back. So maybe they're trying to replicate that by taking a cut.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I suppose that in terms of the easy wins on farmland, is there sort of any measures that you found farmers are more willing to uptake than others, or is there sort of any barriers to sort of getting specific actions implemented?
I think farmers are very connected to hedgerows, and it's just something that it's very rewarding to start to restore your hedgerows. We've probably over-maintained them and been too neat and tidy in the past years, and it's definitely something that you can, get great pride of, to have healthy hedgerows, and so many benefits as well to the farm. For shelter, if you have livestock, it's shelter and a barrier that to keep stock apart. So I would say hedges is number one.
Yeah. And then I suppose following on from that, I suppose which actions would have the greatest positive impact and sort of the most co-benefits? Would you be talking hedgerows again? Or?
I'm biased, aren't I?
Yeah.
Yep. We say hedgerows is the number one action that you can do on your farmland, definitely. Just wonderful if hedgerows could be retained. Definitely retain them. They're even finding now, that the soil under an old hedgerow is very special. It hasn't been fertilized, and it will have lots of soil biodiversity in it as well. So retain those old hedges, and if they need some help, restore them carefully, and then just get good management in to keep them nice and healthy. When we've gone for the very tidy annual cuts, that's really it really knocks them back, and they start to have too many gaps and sort of fade away. So it's good if we can just get a good management of our native hedgerows.
Yeah, and then I suppose in terms of species-rich sort of grassland, would you have any sort of specific advice on sort of sustainable grazing, or would it be something similar along the lines as to graze as late in the year as possible? And
with species-rich grassland?
Yeah, sort of.
Well, it depends if your pasture, are meadow. So for the pasture, you just have to be very careful about the grazing density. And if you've still got pasture and it's still species-rich, you're doing the right thing. So it's really to look at the past management and what you have been doing. So it would get lighter, in the spring, summer, and then Yeah.
Yeah. So someone's just queried here what's the best way to kind of control creeping thistle in old grassland? A spraying sort of will kill sort of.
I don't know how
somebody or-
big their field is, but they could always get the spade out if it's a problem. But I mightn't be very popular from saying that. But okay, if we can, if it's not a problem, and there is too much in the field, if you can get your spade out. I know my dad loved the back of his heel, because he wouldn't have a spade with him, so he used to swing it with the back of a heel. If you get the taproot, it will wilt before it sets seed. Depending on the size of your field.
Yeah. You could have your work cut out. I suppose then just on the app, the Fit.
Yes.
The Fit app. Could you just sort of elaborate a wee bit on that sort of like do people need to be able to identify pollinators to species level, or is it sort of?
I'd say download and have a wee go. It's very good. It just gives groups. So you're just looking at basic groups. It's a fly or a bee or a hoverfly. So I would say download it and give it a go. It leads you through what you need to do. You need to do a wee quadrat and watch that for 10 minutes. But it leads you through it, even times you for how long you count. And then it uploads your data. So it's very quick, easy, and they have certain plants that they like they encourage you to record. But if you don't have that, for example, hawthorn, if you don't have that hawthorn nearby or the flower's over, you could use another plant. So no, give it a go. Very, very straightforward.
From a farmer perspective, Ruth, would you be looking at different areas of the farm when you're monitoring it, or specifically target on one area when you're using the app?
It sort of goes seasonal as well, the plants that it looks at. Dandelion was early, hawthorn. So they could repeat it the next year, which would be interesting, when that plant flowers, if it's something that, they want to look at on an annual basis. But, that's how it would work, that you would go back the next year. Did that answer that okay?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Ruth, someone's just queried your email address there that you had shown on an earlier slide.
Oh dear.
If you could.
rwilson@biodiversityireland.ie. Have I a spelling mistake in there?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure that has now clarified it. No, but that's it from my end, Declan, in terms of questions.
Just when you mentioned field margins, and obviously like maintaining and retaining hedgerows and margins and stuff. Is there any specific target size for your field margins? There's obviously differing levels of buffer zones on farms and stuff. What level of field margin is most beneficial, should we say, from a pollinator perspective?
It's like the hedges as wide. I'd be greedy, wouldn't I? As tall and wide as possible. You talk about sort of 2 meters. Anything over 2 meters is great, but I've heard of 1.5. So around that size can be very useful.
And from a maintenance perspective, obviously it does require maintenance. Is there any specific targets or anything?
Yeah, it's just the end of the season. You could cut and lift if that's possible, or you could let animals graze in, just in a wee bit to take the volume off, and that just helps reduce some of the grass load and the nutrients, and to help it become more species poor, which I think when we've farmed right up to the hedge and added fertilizer and pesticides in that area, I know most of the ones I've looked at, have a lot of cleavers in it and stuff, and a lot of bare ground for other weeds, dominant weeds to move into. So it's just to have a healthy field margin would be fantastic.
And just to come back to the thistle question again there, Ruth, constant cutting, is that sort of a good management practice for them? Or?
Yeah, I'd say get into the root. Yeah. It's a tap. It's a deep root. If you can get into the root, does that answer that? Yeah.
Yeah, and then
before it seeds, you know, if you're cutting before it seeds, you know, it won't spread.
In terms of,
But they're great for pollinators as well. If there's any in a corner that can get away, they're great.
In terms of diversity, do you find that there's more or less sort of diversity in alkaline or acidic soils?
Well, those would form different plant communities. So each are good. You know, there wouldn't be one preference over another. You know, they will form different plant communities. So both are good.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then I suppose any advice on sort of maintaining sort of species-rich uplands or how to go about sort of restoring upland habitats?
So we would be mostly concentrating on lowland intensive agriculture, but in our uplands, yes, it would be just to see what you have and what the past management has been, and then just to see, you know, what would the best way forward be for that area. You know, overgrazing, undergrazing are both problems, so it's just to get a right balance.
Yeah, I suppose it's about sort of determining the present condition that it's in, and
yes, very much so. And it's very important to look, I suppose, at past management. Yeah, and what is your aim? Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ruth.
Is that it, John? That's the questions?
Yeah, that's all the questions so far. If anyone else has any more, I'm sure Ruth will be happy to answer them.
In the absence of anything coming in at the moment, I suppose I just like to thank Ruth for the presentation. It was excellent, informative, and addressing all the questions that have arisen. If there's anything that does come in the next minute or two, we'll pose them to Ruth, and other than that, we can take them and give them to Ruth, and she might be able to reply to them directly herself. As I said, I think I've seen something popping in, John. Anything else?
Yeah, someone's just stood here making hardwood cuttings of willows or an easy way of introducing resources.
That's a lovely idea, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We've got a few of the native willows, and they are fantastic for the pollinators in the spring. The willow and the blackthorn early in the spring, just great idea. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And then, is there a list of beneficial plants anywhere for farmland? I suppose there's resources on the biodiversity data.
Yes, and we have a little flyer as well. It's on the farmland section of the pollinator plan, just on native species that are beneficial in grassland and in hedgerows and stuff. So yeah, we have lists there.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Ruth. Declan, I think that's it. If everyone's happy.
Look, thanks, John, for helping me with the questions and answers there, and to James for setting up the webinar with me today, and all the NRN team for making it a successful event. If you're not a member of the NRN, you can go on to nationalruralnetwork.ie and sign up, and information on webinars such as this, or signpost series webinars in conjunction with Teagasc on Fridays are on there, and obviously links to all our webinars and past case studies. And finally, thanks to Ruth for a fantastic presentation again, and to all who attended here today. And I hope you found the event useful, and hopefully we'll see you in the future again. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation and opportunity to talk.